This is the LatinNews Podcast. I'm Richard McCall here in Bogota, Colombia. My very special guest is at the University of California, Berkeley. She's a distinguished professor of anthropology. Her name is Rosemary Joyce, and we're going to be talking about contemporary Honduras, the issues taking place, the tensions, political tensions underway at the moment in that country. So let me take this moment to say thank you so much, Rosemary, for being on the LatinNews Podcast.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure because, of course, Honduras, I mean, we know a little bit about it in the press and so on, but you are an expert. You follow the security, the politics, and so on. Perhaps we could put everything into context looking at the current president, Xiomara Castro.
Yeah. So to understand where we are in Honduras in 2024, we have to go back to 2009, at least briefly, and remind people that Honduras was the site of the first 21st century coup, it's sometimes described, when President Zelaya was removed from the country forcibly about 6 months before the next presidential elections, because he was advocating for the addition of a non-binding ballot resolution that would have initiated a process to revise the country's constitution. That initially was condemned by all actors, but it's fair to say that the United States was not unenthusiastic about his removal, because President Zelaya, despite coming from a major family of the old colonial elite, had begun to implement policies that were aligning Honduras with the ALBA bloc, and therefore he's usually characterized as the leftist president. From the perspective of 2024, the reason that's relevant is that the 2009 election ushered in a period of 3 subsequent administrations by the National Party, which basically locked down control of the country. The first of those presidents elected has already been convicted of drug trafficking charges, and the second is currently on trial in the Southern District of New York in the US, also for narco-trafficking. So essentially, for the subsequent 12 years, Honduras has been grimly in the hands of an intertwined set of politicians and narco-traffickers. The election of Xiomara Castro de Zelaya, the wife of the removed president, was carried forward by a new political party, which is also notable because the Honduran politics, although multi-party, had been dominated since the 19th century by 2 major parties, the Liberal Party and the Nationalist Party. And Libre, the party that Xiomara Castro represents, arose as a resistance movement to the coup and then organized in successive elections, finally achieving the election of Xiomara.
This is fascinating. Of course, we talk about Zelaya being ousted in this coup in 2009, and then you've got 3 terms, so 12 years, as you said, of right-wing Partido Nacional, National Party, Porfirio Lobo, and Juan Orlando Castro.
Hernández.
Juan Orlando Hernández. And I mean, this pushes Honduras into a sphere where it previously hadn't been, as you say. I mean, do we go as far as to say it was a narco-state?
So there's interesting research that was done. First of all, Hernández actually manipulated the Congress and the Supreme Court into nullifying the constitutional bar against re-election so that he could be re-elected. And looking at the 2 elections of Hernández in particular, there's some very clear evidence of patterns of voting in which narco-trafficking communities were excessive in the number of votes delivered, where on-the-ground observers reported intimidation. So it's clear that there's an imbrication of politicians and narco-traffickers that increase. Now, it's worth saying that narco traffickers had already begun infiltrating Honduras before 2009. My research in Honduras began in the 1970s, so I witnessed the entire transition to civilian government under the first constitution. And it was really in the 1990s that we began to see the increased wealth, which is the first symptom of narco trafficking, really, in most of the region. It is clear that after 2009, the relationship between the ruling party and the presidency and narco trafficking became much stronger.
And this, let's say, cozying up or becoming a member of ALBA by Zelaya back in the day. Now, ALBA, perhaps you could give us a little bit of background on this. This is why, why he was ousted, I suppose.
It's probably the thing that made the U.S. government not enthusiastic about his continuing and caused them to fear that he was advocating what's called the fourth urn, the non-binding ballot referendum to stay in power. ALBA at that moment provided two things to Honduras that it dearly needed. So Honduras has historically been one of the poorest countries in Latin America, moving back and forth from bottom to second from the bottom to third from the bottom. So significantly poor, despite having enormous natural resources, especially mineral wealth, which is what caused Spanish colonization initially and continues to attract international companies, and a fairly positive land to population ratio that should mean that the country could be self-sustaining, as well as the potential for lots of hydroelectric projects. But oil, there is no oil in Honduras. So one of the things that ALBA did in its relationships to member countries that were like Honduras was provide preferential supplies of oil at costs that the government could manage. It solved an energy crisis that had existed for decades, in which the normal people of Honduras would often be without any kind of access to energy. So on the one hand, it did that, and on the other hand, ALBA provided a variety of grants, outright funds, that the Honduran government began to use for initiatives in what it called citizen participation. And it's easy to be cynical about citizen participation. Governments do seem to say we want to have citizen participation, and they mean something very superficial. But in Honduras, a number of these actually addressed the civil rights of previously marginalized groups. Honduras has a very complex population composition going back to the Spanish colonial period. A large number of African descended people were brought to Honduras, many of them enslaved, many of them free. And the population today includes well-established communities that identify, such as the Garifuna, group that descends from enslaved Africans brought to the country by Britain from the island of St. Vincent when they were afraid that the Garifuna would rebel, as had successfully happened in Haiti. The indigenous population, the part that's most internationally recognized is the classic Maya. Their Maya descendants, the Chortí, are sometimes ignored or not seen by visitors, even though they're all around them when they visit the World Heritage Site, Copan. But there are a number of other indigenous groups, the largest of which is the Lenca, who occupy most of the interior of Western Honduras. And along the north coast, the Mosquito and Pesh. And the Mosquito are particularly interesting because they have treaty rights that go back to 1848 as a consequence of a treaty between Honduras and Britain, in which Britain gave Mosquito territory to Honduras, which it shouldn't have done, but that was Britain. In the treaty, though, there was a guarantee that land that was currently occupied by the Mosquito would be titled to them. And that only began in the 1990s. So ALBA provided resources with which the Honduran government began addressing these and other kinds of marginalized communities. So it was less a political reorientation by a member of what would have been called the oligarchy, and more a pragmatic move to have a resource base independent of the US, which has always been the major economic partner for Honduras, but an economic partner based on exploitative and extractive industries.
And of course, this oil for ALBA is coming from Venezuela.
At that point, it was coming from Venezuela. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And
Now, I should say that Zelaya also, in the year before his ouster, clearly also began to see the negative effects of poverty and inequality in the country and had advocated for increases in the minimum wage. So he lost the business community in Honduras because he was literally costing them money.
Yes, I can see how this obviously creates a platform for problems here, but
Yeah.
we get past these 12 years,
Yes.
and this penetration, and I would say probably total flooding of all the economies within Honduras by the narco income, and Honduras is a transit country. I mean, it's not a producing country. Or am I wrong?
So it has historically been a transit country. Recently, the Honduran press has claimed that coca is now being cultivated in eastern Honduras. One of the problems in actually talking about Honduras in 2024 is the erosion of reliable press, which of course is a global phenomenon, but in Honduras was also the outcome of deliberate attempts by the Hernández government to shut down the press voices which were opposition. So I mentioned that is from the Honduran press. I have not seen independent acknowledgement of that, but it is clear that the majority of the drug trafficking going through Honduras is transit.
But I mean, it is an interesting point, this about the production in Central American countries, which is believed to have, I would say it's still in its infancy, but of course the whole idea of the evolution of a drugs trade is the difficult part is the transportation.
Correct.
And to bring the product closer to its end market in the United States would make sense. But again, we are basing this on a report out of the Honduran press, which must be taken with a pinch of salt. So this money, these narco dollars, have infiltrated and penetrated society up from top to bottom, from bottom to top. I would say probably weakening the institutions, which is a real problem through all of the Americas, all of Latin America right now. And Xiomara Castro has been talking and always talks about promises to eradicate and work against corruption. Is there progress on this?
So there has not been as much progress as those observers who hoped, as you would hope would have happened. In retrospect, that's entirely predictable and probably a sign that we should take for all of Latin America about how difficult it is once, as you said correctly, the political establishment is entangled with this kind of capital. To try to disentangle it is very difficult. It's especially difficult for the Libre party's president, Xiomara Castro, because she was elected without a majority for Congress. So the Libre Party has 50 seats in Congress. You need 86 votes to pass legislation. And there is a coalition that is sometimes in opposition to her of minority parties, but that's only got 76 votes. So what we have in Honduras is the kind of thing that happens in a parliamentary system where the president's party may be the plurality, but it is not the majority. And we have that in the context of a country in which presidential power and congressional power are not balanced. One of the things that Hernández worked hard to do was to increase the power of the presidency. But he came from having been the head of Congress, and that by itself is really important. The Congress has a great deal of authority. For example, One of the key ways to address corruption would be to have a not corrupt judicial system. Unfortunately, the Honduran Supreme Court is reselected every 7 years, and that process is in the hands of Congress. Now, this last round, which happened last year, the good news is that there was a formal vetting, so the list of candidates were actually qualified. It seems absurd to have to say that that's good news, but previously that wasn't the case. The bad news is that Congress continued to use a policy that international judicial reform consultants have said they should stop, in which each party within the Congress got a certain number of seats to select from the list. So on the one hand, you have a qualified list of jurists. On the other hand, you have factions choosing their judges. That the president of the country has no role in that. So the Supreme Court becomes the extension, essentially, into the judiciary of the Congress. The second thing that has, I think, definitely delayed improvement was the continuation of the previous Attorney General. Obviously, the Attorney General is the person who's going to bring anti-corruption cases. The anti-corruption movement, the Attorney General was not changed until, I believe, November of this last year, so almost 2 years into the term. The previous Attorney General is now under investigation for corruption, which may be a politically motivated investigation, but the Oscar Chinchilla has been a name that has turned up in other investigations and news reporting. So the judiciary and the Attorney General positions are critical to this. Honduras had placed a lot, or Xiomara had placed a lot of emphasis on renewing the impunity and corruption review by the UN, sponsored by the UN, what's called Chichich in Honduras. That has also been delayed, although the Castro government has absolutely been supporting the return of this UN team, which had been in Honduras looking at corruption, looking at impunity under their Hernandez government, left the country, but they haven't been able to return because to do so requires the removal of a series of laws that were passed under Juan Orlando Hernández, which basically enshrine impunity from investigation of members of the government. So you can't have anti-corruption investigation unless you can follow with charges against government members. 2 at least of those laws were rescinded last year. So progress is slow, and in retrospect, it's probably a legitimate sign of how powerful corruption forces are in the country.
I mean, very hard to undo 12 years within 4 years, but two laws being rescinded, we have to say that's a move in the right direction. I mean, let's paint this in a positive note. Otherwise, we'll probably step away from this conversation feeling very underwhelmed. But this enshrined impunity of which you speak, it seems to be something that is so universal through the region and the judiciary and the Attorney General and these politically motivated, I would say, cases. One thing that you mentioned is that the Libre Party having 50 seats in Congress and needing 86 votes to pass legislation.
Correct.
In order for President Castro to get legislation passed, has she had to make untoward deals with opposition or smaller parties?
I don't think they're untoward deals. Basically, what this illustrates is that it's not unusual in parliamentary systems to have coalitions. So the question is, what are the nature of the coalitions? Are they based on giving advantages that actually are corrupt to other parties? And so far, that's not how this has proceeded. Rather, we have among the coalition of non-Libre parties, smaller parties that actually are committed, it's not so much about the corruption part. I think we have to leave the corruption part to one side. There are three main themes of the current government. One is corruption, one is improving the economy, which is probably where she's made her best advances, and the third is safety and security. The way that the Castro government has been able to proceed on some of its initiatives with congressional coalitions has been in those other two areas. Corruption, as you said, has spread so deeply that there's very little incentive for politicians in general to go along with full-throatedly with removal of that because of the worry that they might become targets. And here we should probably acknowledge that once you have that much corruption in a country, it also becomes a kind of a threat to accuse your enemies of corruption in a system in which, despite the fact that the sort of Napoleonic "you're guilty until proven innocent" thing is no longer part of the legal code, it's still part of the practical everyday way that people approach law. So an accusation is as good as a conviction in neutering somebody.
Yeah, I mean, and this would again would implicate the press as well, because
Absolutely.
of the reporting on this nature, and of course clickbait of that kind of intent. So, I mean, it does sound. I have to say that Castro is improving the economy and working on safety and security. Have security issues worsened immensely under Lobo, Porfirio Lobo, and Juan Orlando Hernández?
Absolutely. During those 12 years, Honduras became one of the capitals of femicide in Latin America. The murder rate in Honduras is usually characterized as one of the highest in the world, if not the highest in the world. Those were not the conditions prior to 2009. The gangs in Honduras are extremely powerful. They are not directly controlled by narco-traffickers, but there is a kind of an ecology in which narco-traffickers and gangs work together to sort of create these territories. And there is a lot of violence that comes out of gangs trying to force people into cooperation. So internal displacement of people fleeing insecurity because of gangs in Honduras led to over 200,000 people last year relocating within the country. These are not the people leaving the country to try and come into the US. This is just people moving within Honduras to try to keep from the impacts of gangs. Historically, one of the realities of Honduras has been that its judicial system works slowly. So pretrial imprisonment of people is quite high. Prisons are not, or have historically not been, under the control of the government, really. They have more become islands of gang-dominated life and recruitment, so sort of a citadel from which gangs have operated. This became visible in the last year, most tragically, in a massacre in a women's prison, which was motivated by one gang basically killing women to provide pressure people who were not imprisoned that the gang was trying to recruit. And no Honduran government has found a good way to deal with these things. The Castro government took two steps that are highly controversial internationally. One is to create a state of exception or a state of emergency, which basically suspends many of the civil rights that people would otherwise have under Honduras Constitution. That was renewed into January. I haven't seen whether it was renewed again. That was taken in order to try to allow for, again, one of the longstanding things going back even before the coup is the process of what's called mano dura, taking a firm hand, which the firm hand has often in Central America meant extrajudicial killings, especially of youths, to the extent that being young and having a tattoo has been life-threatening for people in Honduras. And of course, gangs do stand out for their, sort of using tattoos as a kind of a meta language. So on the one hand, we have the state of exception. And then the second controversial move that the Castro government made was replacing police control of prisons with military or army control of prisons. Historically, again, the police have been incredibly corrupt. The Hernandez government ran a lawn exercise that was sort of a theatrical sort of performance of reviewing all the police to get rid of the bad apples. But it is widely understood by international observers to have been theatrical. The army has historically been seen by Honduran people, there's more trust in the army. The military have been seen as, I know, as a trustworthy force that is not corrupt. Now, corruption's everywhere, but it is the case that Hondurans don't trust the police, and if they have any trust in any form of security apparatus, it is the military.
That's incredibly interesting. I just wanted to ask quickly about the gangs. These are the same gangs that have permeated all of Central America, the Mara Salvatrucha and the Dieciochos?
Yes, and there's a third one whose name has just gone out of my head. Yes, these are the gangs that are the product in some ways of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. immigration policy, deporting people from the U.S. back to El Salvador and Honduras.
And this, so difficult. This state of emergency you speak of is, and of course the mano dura, which again, I think about any Latin American country that needs to deal with incredibly difficult security situations, they come up with the mano dura and they declare a state of emergency. So we don't see any talk of it being lifted. Is this in some way inspired? Of course, we have to talk about the region by President Bukele in El Salvador. Is President Castro looking at, in inverted commas, the success story next door?
I can't impute motivation on Xiomara Castro, but I can say that politicians in Honduras in general look across the border and see what has been portrayed as a success in El Salvador. And this is, again, not just with Bukele. This goes back decades. It goes back before the coup. The first time that mano dura language was used in Honduras that I know of in the 1990s, the reference was again to El Salvador. So there's a constant kind of presence of El Salvador and Honduras being in some ways similar situations, but El Salvador is often, the security situation is worse sooner. The gangs are across both countries. So yes, I think it's fair to assume and that the apparent success of Bukele is, and I use success in quotation marks because there is no real way to assess this as success. I mean, this is one of the tragedies of Central America, certainly possibly of other parts of Latin America, is that the security situation is usually addressed through policing, when international research would suggest that more police doesn't make the situation better. What needs to happen is various forms of development aid, various forms of intervention, and those are expensive. And poor countries don't have the resources for that, which oddly enough gets us to the economic part of this. It's easy to say, okay, great that Honduras now is widely seen internationally as a good country to invest in. It has improved all of its economic markers in the view of the Millennium Corporation of the United States. We could look at that and say, but that's not what she ran on. But in fact, that is part of this story, that if you're going to ever make things better in Honduras, you have to create an economy that works for its people. And here, one of the most interesting things to me as an outsider observing this is that the Castro government, usually described as a leftist government, is in the process right now of trying to institute a graduated income tax and increase income tax collection. Those are two things to increase economic equity, but also to provide the government with the funds that it needs to do the social services, do the interventions, do the other things that it's currently spending far too much, frankly, of its budget on the military and police.
This increase, let's say, in collection, this is not going to be popular.
No, I would, and especially not popular with the people who have a lot of money.
Yes.
Because even though Honduras is a poor country, absolutely, it is a highly unequal country with a business sector that saw the opportunities after the move away from military dictatorship in the 1980s and the passage of the new constitution. Honduras had been stabilized by decades of military dictatorship rule and was seen as a place that had a very large labor pool. So the successive Honduran governments passed legislation to create incentives for international companies to place manufacturing, primarily small manufacturing companies in the country. So it's likely that most listeners may have at some point crossed some product that began part of its life in Honduras, clothing assembly, for example, small electronics, things like that. Those companies, as the integration of economies increased with free trade policies, those companies became very, very successful. And the families that owned them basically catapulted to a level of wealth that had never been seen in Honduras.
Well, we can see this repeated in other Central American countries, but of curiosity to me, as we wind this down, Rosemary, and I need to pick your intelligence here. How much influence or what kind of voter turnout is there in the communities, as you said, the Garifuna or the indigenous communities in Honduras?
Oh, that is an excellent question. So speaking from the US, where voter turnout has always been low, Honduras usually has a much higher turnout for its elections. The indigenous Garifuna and other marginalized communities do vote. What has happened historically is that voting by marginalized communities is often captured by patrons, by patronage. So one of the problems with the election of Juan Orlando Hernández, that the second election, which was widely seen as likely corrupt and likely stolen, major statistical analyses, including one by The Economist, said this pattern just doesn't make any sense. What didn't make sense was that a large rural population provided a vote that pushed Hernandez over the top. That rural population is Lenca population, indigenous population, and it is a population that has been basically addressed in a patronage way and had been by Juan Orlando Hernández throughout his presidency. So they are voting, and Libre, of course, also came out of the indigenous communities and includes African descendant activists, in large part because African descendant people and indigenous people are also providing the majority of the land defenders in Honduras. And land defending in Honduras is a risk of fatality. It is one of the countries that has the highest rate of murders of land defenders. So the original Libre coalition strongly brought in those other parties, those other indigenous groups.
It's a fascinating situation to observe, which obviously, unfortunately, will not be resolved in a short term. As we finish this, my final sort of comment, it's really a comment. Xiomara Castro has come in to make change, to effect change. She is having difficulty with, as you said, point one, corruption. Can we can we suggest that she is clean and uncorruptible, or is she too tarnished by this as well?
So the opposition politicians would like to accuse both Xiomara and her husband Mel Zelaya of corruption. Despite decades of trying to prove that, they have never succeeded. In a country in which, if there were proof, I think it would have emerged. And most importantly, the US government has been assiduous in its investigations of Honduran politicians engaged in the international drug trafficking. The people that have been indicted include presidents, so there's no concern in the US against that. And we have not seen any of any evidence of investigations of either Xiomara or Mel.
I mean, again, a positive, should it be the case, definitely a positive.
Correct.
I mean, when you send down former presidents, it's a big deal, and it does make the headlines. And obviously Honduras not making the positive headlines, but we can take a positive from this, of course. So
Yes.
fascinating. How do you see, and again, how do you see Honduras developing then, and over the next couple of years, the immediate future?
So whenever we talk about the immediate future in a place like Honduras, we can't leave out the global context of climate change, which is actually driving more and more destruction of agricultural possibilities for a largely agricultural country. That as long as there's this enduring poverty, you won't be able to change the situation in Honduras. Castro's government made one move to try to begin to address this, again, very controversial from the US perspective, in abandoning recognition of Taiwan and recognizing China's one China claim and entering into agreements with China to try to develop what's called the Dry Canal, which would be an alternative route of shipping by land across Honduras. This also will include, for the first time, effective train access to parts of interior Honduras. Honduras is notorious in Latin America for being the only country whose capital city was never reached by a train. So my own view of this, like everybody else's, I think, is that until we get climate deterioration under control, we're going to see more and more poverty and destruction in countries like this. They are paying the debt for the economically wealthy northern countries.
A serious issue, and I can only imagine the low-lying islands that produce so much income, the Bay Islands, for the country through tourism. This is a real issue. I remember living in Central America and Guatemala at the time of Hurricane Mitch, of course, which wiped out the whole banana crop there, and much more. The tragic loss of life, of course, in Honduras back in
the most
99.
recent, the 2020 hurricanes in Honduras actually flooded the World Heritage Site of Copan, which is in the highlands. So these impacts are, of course, as you say, on low-lying places, but they're also in the mountainous interior of Honduras, stripping the soil and destroying agricultural fields, but also imperiling the tourism industry. Yeah.
Yes. Incredible. But I think we've covered a lot. We've covered a lot in this short period of time. It has been absolutely fascinating. And let me take this moment to say thank you so much to Rosemary Joyce, who is the Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the University of California in Berkeley. It has been a real pleasure and so very interesting to discuss Honduras with you, Rosemary.
Thank you for the opportunity.
This has been the Latin News Podcast. We've been discussing Honduras, contemporary politics, and of course, the issues taking place in the Central American country. We will be back in a couple of weeks discussing further items and issues from Latin America. We'll be discussing Uruguay. But this has been Richard McCall, your host here in Bogota, Colombia, speaking to Rosemary Joyce of the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you so much for listening to the Latin News Podcast, and goodbye. You are a superstar. That was so interesting. Very interesting indeed.